Hello, my name is Jason Grinblat, and welcome to my PROCJAM 2018 talk titled Meaning Alchemy. So I'm a game maker. I founded a small studio called Freehold Games where we do a lot of work with procedural generation. We made the roguelikes Caves of Qud and Wood. I like to experiment with procedural generation on my personal projects as well. So Diaspora, for instance, procedurally generates descriptions of space colonies. I made it for PROCJAM 2014. And I'm most well known for Caves of Qud, so let me tell you a little bit about Caves of Qud. It's a science fantasy, open world, role-playing roguelike. The tagline is chiseled through a layer cake of thousand-year-old civilizations. It's inspired by new wave sci-fi and weird fiction, and it's set in an unrecognizable world where animals, plants, and robots have been uplifted to human-level intelligence, and humans have become vastly and diversely mutated. It weaves a traditional RPG narrative through deep physical, social, and historical systems, and so it's very much a hybrid, handcrafted, and procedurally generated project. So I love player stories. They're one of the main motivations for making Caves of Qud. And I want to tell you about a story my friend Nick told me about one of his characters. So first you have to imagine that in Caves of Qud, you're a lore seeker in a wild and fractured world. Nick's character had just arrived at this place called the Six-Day Stilt, which is the largest city in Qud. It's where a religious sect of machine worshippers called the Mechanimists have recently erected a cathedral. And the thing about the Stilt is that it's populated with all sorts of creatures who have converted to the faith of the Mechanimists. So for instance, this is a sentient mushroom. You can talk to it. It'll tell you about the glory of Shekinah, who's the Mechanimist deity. And so Nick had arrived at this stilt and indeed saw a sentient mushroom convert. He also saw a group of merchants led by a jeweler who were converts as well. And as these two groups started to interact, the mushroom actually billowed a cloud of spores onto these merchants, and they got into a large melee. And Nick interpreted this as sort of the religious dispute of two factional subsects of the Mechanimist faith. Over the course of this battle, the jeweler actually died, dropping a bunch of precious jewel-encrusted equipment. And as so often the case in Qud, the spoils tend to go to the survivors. And so Nick sort of waited for the fray to clear so that he can creep by and loot the jeweler's body of all of this jewel-encrusted loot. Now, there were still some spores spewing about, but he judged this worth the risk to acquire this loot. And so he did, and he decked himself out in this jewel-encrusted equipment. But over the course of the next few days, he actually did contract Fungal, this fungal infection on his head. The way fungal infections work in Qud is that they occupy one of your limbs and they prevent you from equipping equipment on that limb. And Fungal is a particularly nasty fungal infection is because whenever you get hit, whenever you take damage, you billow this cloud of spores yourself, and that can make interacting with NPCs quite difficult. But having one limb infected with Fungal isn't so bad. But the problem was that Nick also had this mutation called temporal fugue, which lets him summon time clones from across space and time to fight for him. And each of these clones, when they were damaged, would billow a cloud of spores, and those spores could infect Nick's character. And so whenever he would get into a large brawl, all of his clones would start spewing spores and he'd be infected with Fungal all over again. And he had to keep summoning his clones because in Caves of Qud, battles can be quite deadly, and so you need to use all the resources you can. And so over time, he accrued more and more of these fungal infections, his skin erupting into fungal growths, tearing through his jewel-encrusted loot and ripping it off his body. And so he became sort of desperate to cure these infections. And so in Caves of Qud, fungal infections have procedurally generated cures. And in this game, he needed to find the corpse of this rare creature called an electric snail. And so he started to search far and wide for this corpse. He plumbed the slime-drenched depths of Qud, trawling the nooks and crannies that are home to its lowest creatures. until finally he remembered that there was actually a snail farm back at the 6-day stilt. And so he returned there, and under the cover of night, he murdered the farmer and the snails. But even then, he didn't find the corpse, because creatures only have a percentage chance to drop their corpse in Caves of Qud. And so at this point, Nick said he imagined his character taking stock of this situation. He saw how far he'd fallen from his bejeweled heyday, and he humbly padded into the Cathedral of the Mechanimous, where he made an offering of all of his jeweled equipment to the sacred well and converted to the Mechanimous faith. So I love this story. It has everything I like about a player story. It has a handcrafted content with strong authorial intent. So, I placed the 6-day stilt there. It's sort of a handwritten set piece. I knew what types of encounters would occur there. It has procedurally generated content. So the fact that the fungal infection cure was this electric snail corpse, the fact that the converts for that game were mushrooms and merchants. It had predicted system dynamics, but also had unpredicted system dynamics. So I knew that the system would generate some converts, some religious converts, but I didn't know that the mushroom would still billow spores and aggro the other group of converts, even though they should ostensibly have the same faction. I also didn't know that the clones would billow spores and infect Nick with his own fungal mutation or fungal infection. It has an emergent narrative. That is what this story was. It's this story of this character who took this advantage of this opportunity, but then started to regret it over time. And there's a whole narrative arc until ultimately there's a sort of redemption conclusion as he converts to the Mechanimous faith. It also has a very important piece here, which is the player interpretation. So Nick was able to stitch together this sort of emergent narrative that came out of the systems into something that made more sense for him. So it was Nick who decided that the factions were having a religious dispute, right? It was Nick who put some additional interpretation into the actions of his character. But, this is just a list of traits that this story had. I really want to get at this sort of alchemical reactions going on here, how the various reagents react to produce a meaningful experience. So today I'm going to meditate with you on this alchemy. So I've broken this talk into 3 parts. The first, I'll tell you about the 3-headed creator of these types of experiences. Then I'll tell you about the relationship these experiences have with nonfiction. And finally, I'll walk through some techniques I found useful to catalyze these alchemical reactions. So first, when we're talking about meaning itself is a slippery concept. So I've defined meaning as a sublime resonance in our network of representations. An experience is meaningful if it plucks the strings between the right nodes in our concept map in a way that grabs our attention, that's music to our ears. And so Nick's experience playing Caves of Qud was meaningful, as was my experience hearing about it. And we could ask, how different was Nick's experience from what I intended? Was it meaningful in different ways? Games are dynamic, interactive, alive, especially when they leverage procedural generation. So could I anticipate Nick's experiences? So we can talk about games this way using the language of a familiar dichotomy. So I'm going to paint a picture here. A dichotomy between traditional static media and interactive or generative media. So in traditional media, let's say like literature, we can think of meaning as flowing from the author to the reader. And now the picture is more complicated than this, and we'll get to that in a few minutes, but this is at least a basic model to work from. In games, our meaning gets refracted through our systems, and the player experiences some range of that spectrum. But the refraction itself is a form of meaning making. So in particular, there's what's called the proceduralist reading of games, described by game researcher Ian Bogost. So Bogost argues that the unique meaning-making strategy of games is procedural rhetoric, the act of making an expression or argument through a game's processes or rules. The idea about by taking a role in navigating the system, the player can gain some unique insight on it. I think there's an analogy here for non-playable creative artifacts. So we could think of a bot mom who creates a bot, and her meaning is refracted through the possibility space of the bot, and the user experiences some range of that spectrum. So now I think this is a useful dichotomy to make between the traditional media and games or interactive media, but it's important to remember that meaning is a complex phenomenon, right? It's encoded in this huge tangled network of representations, and there's no reason to think that my representations as an author are the same as yours as a reader. And this idea is sort of alive in the traditional media criticism. So like in literature, we can learn from the traditions of literary criticism that deprivilege the author's intent, arguing that the network of representations referenced by a text will resonate differently for a reader than they did for the author. And in that way, the reader will lift their own meaning for the page. So even static artifacts like books are alive, are rife with dormant microbes of unstable meaning, waiting to be resurrected by a new reader and the context they bring. So it's good to situate the quest to understand the mechanics of meaning in this larger tradition, and then to recognize that meaning is always unstable, even in traditional media. But generative art and games embed this additional layer of instability. So a model that I like to use to help think about this is this idea of the story volume. So this is especially good for narrative games or for games that produce emergent narratives. So the idea is that a storyline is a single traversal through story space. And a story volume is a collection of generated or emergent stories that's been produced by a system with a carefully set of curated system parameters. So it's important to realize here that a story volume isn't just an enclosure of some random number of storylines. It's more that it's a family of related storylines. So if I'm designing a game that tries to tell a bunch of stories about the theme of love, or tries to tell a bunch of stories who share a sort of bleak mood, I'm encoding that meaning into my system parameters. And in that way, I'm sort of pushing my meaning out into the system, which then, as we've discussed, will get refracted and end up being interpreted by the player in a myriad number of ways. So the relationship between these two nodes, the designer and systems, is very interesting, and I want to talk a little bit more about it. So Kate Compton, in her talk Bot Poetics, refers to the idea of the bot as Horcrux. She says when she's created a bot, she's taken a part of herself and externalized it. And when you externalize this piece of your creative self, you're able to see it in action. And a few things happen as a result of that. So on the one hand, you're able to parallelize yourself. You let the bot explore some of the possibility space that you've outlined, and you see things the bot come up with that you may not have, or maybe you would have given enough time, but you haven't been able to. But you could also take that output and process it and feed it back into your systems. And so I realized that the idea of the bot as Horcrux evokes something for me. It makes me realize that the creative process itself is a form of procedural generation. So when we're sketching out ideas, let's say I want to create this headdress and I'm sketching out ideas for it, you're exploring paths in the possibility space, you're culling some of them, you're nurturing others. And so a nice example of this in action is Emily Short's 2015 NaNoGenmo entry, The Annals of the Peregrines, which is a half-generated, half-authored travel guide for a fictional country based on England. The process she used, which she describes in her 2016 PROCJAM talk, is that she would write pieces of the generator. She would write pieces of the system. She would generate output, read the output, take notes, update the generator, add some handcrafted material to it. And so over time, she kind of collaborated with the generator, as she puts it, to produce this artifact, this fictional travel guide. And so in this way, the system can feed meaning back to the designer, who can then re-encode it into the systems. But this picture is actually more complicated, right? Because the designer can also communicate directly with the player, as I did with some static handwritten set pieces. So, when I wrote the 6-day stilt for Caves of Qud, I knew that it would have a certain meaning for the player. Of course, this, when I say directly, given our earlier conversation about how the instability of meaning, even when there's this direct flow of it, that's a caveat we have to take in mind. But we can still kind of draw this picture here and model how we're communicating a meaning, unstable as it is, directly to a player versus refracting it through our systems. But it's even more complicated than that, because if we have a game like Caves of Qud where we have modding tools, the player can include their own meaning into the system, which gets fed back into other players. And then a game that's in perpetual development, or at least that's still in development, like Caves of Qud, the players are giving their feedback to the designers as well, who are then re-encoding it into the systems and sending it out to other players. So this, in effect, produces this three-headed creator of these meaningful experiences. So I want you to imagine Nick's story again, but imagine that I hand wrote all of the story beats instead of them coming about emergently. So I knew that there'd be two sub-factions of the Mechanimist that would fight at the 6-day still. I knew that he would go looking for an electric snail corpse but wouldn't find it. There's something less interesting about that story when I've written it versus when it was generated by the system emergently. So I was talking to James Ryan, who's a games researcher and generative artist. He co-created Bad News, which is an installation game that combines procedural generation and interactive live performance. So he has a simulation that generates 100 years of history for an American town, and you play a mortician's assistant tasked with finding the next of kin of a recently deceased town person. And you role play with Ben, an actor who interacts behind the scenes with James, who's the wizard, who's querying the simulation for information relevant to the scene you're in. And James feeds that info secretly to Ben, stuff like character traits, and Ben uses that to inform his role-playing experience. He's also using that simulation behind Bad News to create Sheldon County, which is a procedurally generated podcast about a fictional American county. You could imagine a sort of PROCJAM This American Life. And so James and I were swapping stories. I was telling him about some of the player stories players have told me about their experiences with Caves of Qud. He was telling me about some of the interesting things to come out of the simulations of Bad News in Sheldon County. And he said something very interesting. He said that emergent narratives are interesting because they're abiding by the aesthetics of nonfiction. So he said Sheldon County is a meditation on the notion that emergent narrative is literally nonfiction. And this really resonated with me. So I want to think about it in the context of the game that's maybe most rife with emergent narrative potential, Dwarf Fortress, and look at how emergent narratives are functioning there. So Stephanie Bollock and Patrick Lemieux are these games researchers and media researchers that wrote this fascinating essay about Dwarf Fortress called Dwarven Epitaphs. So Dwarven Epitaphs are themselves these metagame artifacts that the Dwarf Fortress community has created to make sense of their experiences with the game. They made a real interesting observation about Dwarf Fortress and its relationship to a particular tradition of historiography. So they said both the medieval annal and the chronologies of Dwarf Fortress's Legends mode follow a narrative model that is non-teleological and that deprivileges the place of the human within historical time. So the idea is that these emergent narratives around the lives of dwarves are special precisely because the dwarves are so unspecial. They don't occupy a privileged position in the world or its systems, and so the things that happen to them are rare and personal. No one is tipping the scales of fate in or against their favor. And these systems recreate the relationship that exists between us and our world, and by doing so, they speak to the truth of our experiences. Even if these truths are rendered in low granularity because the simulations aren't perfect, right? Like even Dwarf Fortress isn't a full simulation, they still speak to us on these terms. And there's a sense that the brain is such a powerful creative force. It's so good at connecting disparate nodes that the stories our produces speak less to these systemic truths because they're less authentic. They're too easily generated. And in that sense, these stories that are emerging are more authentic, personal, precious, and in that sense, abiding by the sort of aesthetics of nonfiction. So now I want to tell you about some techniques I found to help catalyze these meaning-making reactions. So we talked about story volumes, but how do you create a system that's going to produce the story volume that you want? Where do you start? And so there's a technique that I know that a lot of people who work with procedural generation use. I like to call it story interpretation, or I'm sorry, story interpolation. I know Zach and Tarn Adams from Dwarf Fortress like to call it story analysis. Basically, the idea is that you write out these sort of moments of a single story. You write out multiple of them, and then you sort of look to see what system parameters could have generated them, and you interpolate a system between them. So I'm going to show you two slides from Tarn Adams' talk at Progression Mechanics 2017, which is a conference at Northwestern University, where he talked about emergent narrative in Dwarf Fortress. So he imagined with the audience of the talk that they were going to make a game about sparrows and pillbugs. And so he wrote out this little micro-narrative. A flock of sparrows landed and ate most of the pillbugs, but one managed to survive and to lay some eggs. So it has like a note of drama. It's just this very short one-sentence narrative about pillbugs and sparrows. And then he goes on in the next slide to deconstruct this sentence and look at all the ways you can spin each piece of it into a sort of three-dimensional volume that implies the system that might have generated it. So we have a flock of sparrows. So is there flocking behavior or something else going on? When we have the word sparrows, are there other species of birds? So the idea is that we can kind of spin each of these little segments of the sentence about their axes, look at the sort of possibility space that it could produce, and from those sort of little disjointed volumes, interpolate between them what sort of system might produce all those things, or what sort of combination of systems. Okay, I want to tell you about another technique that I like to call PROCJAM layering. So if you've watched any talk on procedural generation, you may have very likely heard reference to the 10,000 bowls of oatmeal problem that Kate Compton describes. The idea is that you can generate 10,000 bowls of oatmeal, and they might be mathematically unique, but to a human who's looking at them, they're probably just going to look like a bunch of bowls of oatmeal. And so there's this idea that we want to go for perceptual uniqueness versus just the strict mathematical uniqueness. And a good way to achieve this, I've found, is by layering PROCJAM at different tiers, at different granularities. And this technique comes up a lot. So this is Brogue. It's a beautiful roguelike made by Brian Walker. And Brian gave a talk at Roguelike Celebration a couple weeks ago about his level generation. This is actually a slide from his talk. So the way his level generation works is that he uses a technique called cellular automata to generate these levels. But those levels tend to be sort of samey. They don't have that perceptual uniqueness. And so he drops a larger scale generated artifact like a lake into the middle of it. And that's the sort of layering that I'm talking about. So Emily Short does something similar to this with her Nils at the Perigs, which again, she talks about in her 2016 PROCJAM talk. She has these 5 suits that encapsulate 5 axes of meaning that she's hand designed, and her PROCJAM work inherits from it. So, she's generating hundreds of descriptions of duchies and counties and taverns, and if that's all she did, that they could very likely start to feel samey. But what she does is she has these 5 suits that seed the procedural generation. And so each of these hundreds of leaf node artifacts, the actual text of the taverns and the duchies and the counties, are seeded from this more macro structure that produces this sort of layered, textured effect to the artifact. We do this in Caves of Qud too, so we procedurally generate history each game. We generate these ancient rulers called sultans, 5 of them per game, and each one has something like 15 or 20 life events that we record. And so over the course of the game, there's, upwards of 100 of these generated events. And so if we were just generating these events, it'd be very hard to tell the sort of texture and structure of these events apart from game to game. So what we do is we do some higher level macro variation about the way that these sultans are related or are related to the culture that they came from. So for instance, in some games we decide that the sultans are all part of one or several, but in this case, one dynasty. So, each of those 5 sultans we see here, this is a story about Ishir the Fourth. And it encodes this extra meaning for historical snippets like this, because we can see here that Ishir assassinated the Sultan of Qud over an ordinance prohibiting the practice of burying prisms under the earth. And because this was a instance of game history that was a single dynasty, that sultan that Ishir assassinated was actually his parent. We do other things where we do this macro variation on the way that the ancient archaeology that Qud is set in the ruins of related to each other. So sometimes the precincts in that archaeology were partitioned by wealth. So you would have wealthy districts and middle-class districts and slum districts. And sometimes they're related by operating principles. So sometimes there's a forum province, sometimes there's a museum province. And this creates different context for you to interpret the lives of the individual sultans and the individual events in their lives in this sort of layered, textured way. Finally, I want to talk to you about the power of words. So Tanya Short touches on this in her GDC talk last year about writing modular characters for systems-driven games. So what I want to say is that words move quickly. They have a lot of power to convey meaning. We remember that highly creative brain we saw. Words are one of its most powerful tools. So this is a procedurally generated NPC from Caves of Qud. We can see she's loved by the villagers of Mamas, hated by the villagers of Alash for disparaging a famous poet. She's also hated by bears for reprogramming their favorite robot. So these faction alignments here, the fact that she's loved by these villagers or hated by these villagers or hated by bears, have real systems meaning in game. There's a faction and reputation system that dictates the relationship NPCs have to each other and the way NPCs feel about you. And that is all systems generated. But these descriptions for why this mayor is hated or loved by these various factions are flavor text essentially, right? They're generated using words, but they're adding a lot of meaning to this experience, to the experience of interacting with this character, even though they're not strictly reflected in the game systems. So your systems are your lithosphere. You need them to build stable structures. Your words are your atmosphere. You can sort of still leverage the aesthetics of nonfiction if your game's experiences are grounded in its systems, but you can build wind sails for your players and blast them to new heights of meaning with the power of words. And that is my talk for PROCJAM 2018. Thank you for listening and have a great PROCJAM.